Chapter 14. The Arts in Greece. In the middle of the 5th century, Athens found itself as the most powerful city in Greece. Pericles, descended from one of the noble families, was then the director of the affairs of the state. He was a man of few words, and never sought to flatter the vanity of the people. But the Athenians respected him, and acted only in accordance with his counsels. They had faith in his knowledge of all the details of administration and the resources of the state, and so they permitted him to govern. For 40 years, Pericles was the soul of the politics of Athens. As Thucydides, his contemporary, said, the democracy existed in name. In reality, it was the government of the first citizen. In Athens, as in the majority of Greek cities, the houses of individuals were small, low, and packed closely together, forming narrow streets, tortuous and ill-paved. The Athenians reserved their display for their public monuments. After they levied heavy war taxes on their allies, they had large sums of money to expend, and these were employed in erecting beautiful edifices. In the marketplace they built a portico or poikile, adorned with paintings, in the city a theatre, a temple in honor of Theseus, and the Odeon for the contests in music. But the most beautiful monuments rose on the rock of the Acropolis, as on a gigantic pedestal. There were 2 temples of which the principal, the Parthenon, was dedicated to Athena, the protecting goddess of the city. A colossal statue of bronze represented Athena, and a staircase of ornamental character led up to the Propylaea. Athens was from this time the most beautiful of the Greek cities. Athens became at the same time the city of artists. Poets, orators, architects, painters, sculptors, some Athenians by birth, others come from all corners of the Greek world, met here and produced their masterpieces. There were, without doubt, many Greek artists elsewhere than at Athens. There had been before the 5th century, and there was a long time afterward, but never were so many assembled at one time in the same city. Most of the Greeks had fine sensibilities in matters of art, but the Athenians more than all others had a refined taste, a cultivated spirit, and a love of the beautiful. If the Greeks have gained renown in the history of civilization, it is that they have been a people of artists. Neither their little states nor their small armies have played a great role in the world. This is why the 5th century is the most beautiful moment in the history of Greece. This is why Athens has remained renowned above all the rest of the Greek cities. Epistles Athens, the city of eloquence, holds sway over all. The speeches delivered in the assembly determine matters of war, peace, taxes, and all other state affairs of importance. The speeches given before the courts either condemn or acquit citizens and subjects. The orators hold the power. The people follow their counsel and often entrust them with important public functions. Cleon is appointed general, and Demosthenes directs the war against Philip. The orators wield great influence, employing their talents in eloquence to accuse their political enemies. Often they possess wealth, for they are paid for supporting one party or the other. Aeschines is retained by the king of Macedonia, and Demosthenes accepts fees from the king of Persia. Some of the orators, instead of delivering their own speeches, wrote them for others. When an Athenian citizen had a case in court, he did not desire, as we do, an advocate to plead his case for him. The law required that each person speaks in person. Therefore he sought an orator and had him compose a speech, which he learned by heart and recited before the tribunal. Other orators travelled through the cities of Greece, speaking on subjects that pleased their fancy. Sometimes they gave lectures, as we would say. The oldest orators spoke simply, limiting themselves to an account of the facts without oratorical flourishes. On the platform they were almost rigid, without loud speaking or gesticulation. Pericles delivered his orations with a calm air, so quietly that no fold of his mantle was disturbed. When he appeared at the tribune, his head, according to custom, crowned with leaves, he might have been taken, said the people, for a god of Olympus. But the orators who followed wished to move the public. They assumed an animated style, pacing the tribune in a declamatory and agitated manner. The people became accustomed to this form of eloquence. The first time that Demosthenes came to the tribune, the assembly shouted with laughter. The orator could not enunciate, and he carried himself poorly. He disciplined himself in declamation and gesture, and became the favorite of the people. Later, when he was asked what was the first quality of the orator, he replied, action, and the second action, and the third, action. Action, that is delivery, was more important to the Greeks than the sense of the discourse. In ancient times there were a group of learned men in Asia called the sages. They were wise and knowledgeable, delving into the fields of physics, astronomy, and natural history. They were also scholars, reflecting on the world around them. The 7 sages of Greece were among the most celebrated of these wise men during the 7th century. However, around the time of Pericles, a new group of men emerged in Athens called the Sophists. They claimed to teach wisdom and charged fees for their lessons. They often criticized the religion, customs, and institutions of Greek cities, arguing that they were not based on reason. They believed that humans could not know anything with certainty, and that nothing was true or false. They were skeptics who believed that nothing existed, and even if it did, humans could not know it. Some of these sophists were also skilled orators. Socrates, an old man from Athens, opposed the sophists. He was not wealthy or eloquent like the sophists, but he went around the city talking to people and asking them questions that led them to discover what he had in mind. He especially sought out young men and gave them guidance and instruction. Socrates did not claim to be a scholar, saying that his only knowledge was that he knew nothing. He called himself a philosopher, meaning a lover of wisdom. He was not interested in the sciences or the nature of the world, but focused solely on humanity. His motto was, "Know thyself," and he preached about virtue. However, the Athenians mistook Socrates for a sophist because he spoke about morals and religion. In 399, he was brought before the court on charges of not worshipping the city's gods, introducing new gods, and corrupting the youth. He did not try to defend himself, and was sentenced to death at the age of 70. Xenophon, one of the followers of the great philosopher Socrates, took it upon himself to transcribe their conversations, and even wrote an apology on his behalf. Another of his pupils, Plato, wrote a series of dialogues in which Socrates was the main character. Since then, Socrates has been hailed as the father of philosophy. Plato himself went on to establish a school, and Aristotle, one of his students, compiled all the scientific knowledge of his time in his books. Other philosophers who came after them aligned themselves with either Plato or Aristotle, with Plato's followers calling themselves academicians, and Aristotle's disciples naming themselves peripatetics. The Greeks had a tradition of dancing in their religious ceremonies, with young men performing a series of noble and expressive poses around the altar dedicated to the god. This dance, accompanied by chants in honor of the god, was known as the chorus. Each city had its festival chorus, with the children of the most prominent families participating after a long period of preparation. The god deserved nothing less than a group worthy of him. In the flatlands surrounding Athens, young men celebrated the god of the vintage, Dionysos, with religious dances each year. One of these dances was solemn and depicted the actions of the god, with the leader of the chorus portraying Dionysos, and the chorus itself playing the role of his companions, the satyrs. Over time, they began to portray the lives of other gods and ancient heroes. It was then that Thespis, a Greek innovator, came up with the idea of setting up a stage on which an actor could perform while the chorus rested. This new form of entertainment was perfected and moved to the city, where it was performed under a black poplar tree in the marketplace, and thus tragedy was born. In ancient Greece, the art of theatre was born. 2 types of plays were performed, tragedy and comedy. Tragedies were serious, featuring heroes and their struggles, while comedies were light-hearted and made fun of everyday life. The masked dancers who performed the comic dances chanted praises to Dionysos, mixed with jeers towards the audience and humorous observations about current events. This is how comedy was born. Even when performed in the theatre, both types of plays were still played before the altar of the god. The choir continued to dance and chant around the altar, even after the actors became the most important part of the spectacle. In comedies, sarcastic remarks about the government were made during the parabasis. To ensure that all Athenians could attend these spectacles, a theatre was built on the side of the Acropolis that could hold 30,000 people. The theatre was open to the sky and made up of tiers of rock arranged in a half-circle around the orchestra, where the chorus performed and the stage where the play was given. Plays were only produced during the festivals of the god, but they continued for several days in a row. Each day began at sunrise and ended at torchlight with the production of a trilogy of tragedies, followed by a satirical drama. Each trilogy was the work of one author, and the public determined the victor in a competition between poets. The most famous competitors were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. There were also contests in comedy, but only the works of one comic poet, Aristophanes, remain. Greek temples. In Greece, The most magnificent structures were erected to honor the gods. When we think of Greek architecture, it is their temples that come to mind. A Greek temple is not like a Christian church, which is designed to receive worshippers who come to pray. Instead, it is the palace where the god resides, represented by an idol. Men feel compelled to make this palace splendid. The majority of worshippers do not enter the temple's interior. They remain outside, surrounding the altar in the open air. At the center of the temple is the chamber of the god, a mysterious sanctuary without windows, dimly lit from above. On the floor stands the idol, made of wood, marble, or ivory, adorned with gold garments and jewels. The statue is often colossal. In the Temple of Olympia, Zeus is depicted sitting, and his head almost touches the summit of the temple. If the god should rise, they said, his head would shatter the roof. This sanctuary, a kind of reliquary for the idol, is hidden from view on every side. To enter, one must pass through a porch formed by a row of columns. Behind the chamber is the rear chamber, where the valuable property of the god is kept, his riches and often the gold and silver of the city. Therefore the temple serves as a storehouse, treasury, and museum. Rows of columns surround the building on four sides, like a second wall protecting the god and his treasures. There are 3 orders of columns that differ in base and capital, each bearing the name of the people who invented it or used it most frequently. They are, in order of age, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The temple is named after the style of the columns that support it. Above the columns, encircling the structure, are sculpted surfaces of marble, known as the metopes, which alternate with plain blocks of marble, known as the triglyphs. Together, the metopes and triglyphs make up the frieze. The temple is crowned with a triangular pediment adorned with statues. Greek temples were polychromatic, meaning they were painted in multiple colors, including yellow, blue, and red. For a long time, modern scholars refused to believe this, thinking that the Greeks had too refined a taste to add color to their buildings. However, traces of paint have been found on several temples, leaving no doubt about the matter. It has since been concluded that these bright colors were used to enhance the lines of the building. The characteristics of Greek architecture are unique. At first glance, a Greek temple appears to be a simple, unadorned structure, just a long box of stone perched on a rock, with a square facade topped by a triangle. However, upon closer inspection, it is discovered that not a single line is truly straight. The columns bulge in the middle, the vertical lines are slightly inclined, and the horizontal lines bulge a little at the center. These subtle details are so fine that precise measurements are required to detect them. Greek architects discovered that to create a harmonious whole, they needed to avoid geometrical lines that would appear stiff, and instead take into account the illusions of perspective. As a Greek writer once said, "The aim of the architect is to invent processes for deluding the sight." Greek artists worked conscientiously, as they were creating structures for the gods. As a result, their monuments were elaborated in every detail, even those that were not visible to the eye. They were constructed so solidly that they would still be standing today had they not been destroyed by violence. The Parthenon, for example, was still standing in the 17th century before an explosion of gunpowder destroyed it. The Greeks crafted their architecture with a blend of solidity and elegance, simplicity and science. While most of their temples have vanished, a few remain in ruins, with roofs collapsed and only rows of columns standing. Yet, even in this state, they captivate those who lay their eyes upon them. Sculpture was a mere accessory ornament for the Egyptians and Assyrians, but for the Greeks it was the principal art. Their most celebrated artists, Phidias, Praxiteles, and Lysippus, were all sculptors. They created bas-reliefs to embellish the walls of a temple, its facade or pediment. One such work is the renowned frieze of the Panathenaic procession, which was carved around the Parthenon. It depicts young Athenian women on the day of the great festival of the goddess. Most of the sculptures were statues that represented gods and served as idols, while others depicted victorious athletes in the great games and served as their reward. The earliest Greek statues were stiff and unrefined, akin to Assyrian sculptures, and often colored. Gradually they became graceful and elegant. The most exceptional works were those of Phidias in the 5th century and Praxiteles in the 4th. The statues of the following centuries were more graceful, but less noble and less powerful. In ancient Greece, there existed thousands of statues, each city having its own. For 5 centuries, sculptors worked tirelessly, producing an abundance of art. Unfortunately, only about 15 complete statues have survived to this day. None of the celebrated masterpieces of Greek art remain. The most famous Greek statues we have are either copies or works from the period of decadence. However, we still have enough fragments of statues and bas-reliefs to provide a general understanding of Greek sculpture. Greek sculptors aimed to represent the most beautiful bodies in a calm and noble attitude. They had numerous opportunities to view beautiful bodies of men in beautiful poses, such as at the gymnasium, in the army, and in sacred dances and choruses. They studied these bodies and learned to reproduce them with unparalleled precision. Greek statues typically feature a small head, a face without emotion, and a dull expression. The Greeks did not strive for facial expressions as we do. Instead, they focused on the beauty of the line and did not sacrifice the limbs for the head. In Greek statues, the entire body is beautiful. Pottery was also a significant art form in Greece. The Greeks called it ceramics, and it was not held in the same esteem as other arts. However, it has the advantage of being better known than the others. While temples and statues have fallen into ruin, the achievements of Greek potters are preserved in tombs, where they are still found today. Over 20,000 specimens of painted vases and statuettes of baked earth have been collected in museums across Europe. There were also illustrious painters in Greece, such as Zeuxis, Parrhasius, and Apelles. Unfortunately, we know little about them beyond some anecdotes and descriptions of their paintings. To get an impression of Greek painting, we are limited to the frescoes found in the houses of Pompeii, an Italian city from the 1st century of our era. However, this is not enough to truly understand the art of Greek painting. Chapter 15. The Greeks in Asia before Alexander. The Persian Empire was in decline, despite the Greeks ceasing their attacks and even taking orders from the great king. The satraps, or governors, no longer obeyed the government and became little kings in their provinces, waging war as they pleased. The great king had little power to remove them, resorting to assassination. The Persians were no longer feared by other Asian peoples. Greek captain Xenophon, who had been in their pay, described them as decadent, reclining on tapestries wearing gloves and furs. Even their servants were transformed into knights for the sake of pay. Although their armies were large, they were of no service, as their enemies moved more freely through the empire than their friends. They lacked courage and military strength, conceding their inferiority and only daring to fight with Greek auxiliaries on their side. This weakness was evident in 400 when Cyrus, brother of the great king Artaxerxes, marched against him to secure his throne. Cyrus hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and they crossed Asia to Babylon without resistance. In battle, the Greeks chased the barbarians who fled before they could even shoot arrows. They let the war chariots through their ranks without receiving any harm except for one who was wounded with an arrow. Cyrus was killed, and his army disbanded without fighting. The Persians did not dare to attack the Greeks, but they killed their leaders and soldiers who came to conclude a truce. Xenophon recorded their expedition. The mercenaries, without friends to guide them, elected new leaders and set fire to their tents and chariots before beginning their retreat. They trekked through the rugged mountains of Armenia, facing famine, snow, and the arrows of hostile natives who sought to stop them. Despite these obstacles, they reached the Black Sea and returned to Greece after traversing the entire Persian Empire. Upon their return in 399, their numbers still totaled 8,000. 3 years later, Agesilaus, the king of Sparta, invaded the wealthy regions of Asia Minor, including Lydia and Phrygia, with a small army. He battled the satraps and planned to invade Asia, but the Spartans ordered him to return home to fight the armies of Thebes and Athens. Agesilaus was the first Greek to dream of conquering Persia, but he was distressed to see his fellow Greeks fighting amongst themselves. When they informed him of their victory at Corinth, where only 8 Spartans had died compared to 10,000 of the enemy, he did not rejoice. Instead, he sighed and lamented, "Alas, unhappy Greece, to have lost enough men to have subjugated all the barbarians." On another occasion he refused to destroy a Greek city, stating, "If we exterminate all the Greeks who fail in their duty, where shall we find the men to vanquish the barbarians?" This sentiment was uncommon at the time. Xenophon, his biographer, exclaimed, "Who else regarded it as a misfortune to conquer when he was making war on peoples of his own race?" After a century of war, Sparta and Athens were exhausted and had given up their fight against the Persian king. The Macedonians, a rough and uncultured people similar to the ancient Dorians, took up the cause and brought it to an end. They were shepherds and soldiers who lived in 2 large valleys that opened to the sea far north of Greece. The Greeks held little respect for them, considering them half barbarians. However, since the kings of Macedon claimed to be descendants of Heracles, they were allowed to participate in the Olympian Games horse races, which gave them some standing as Greeks. In the heartland of Greece, far from the sea, the kings held little sway over the wars of their fellow Greeks. But in the year 359 BC, a young, bold, and ambitious man named Philip rose to the throne of Macedon. He had 3 goals in mind: to build a strong army, to conquer all the ports along the coast of Macedon, and to unite all the Greeks under his command against the Persians. It took him 24 long years, but he succeeded in all 3 of his aims. The Greeks mostly left him alone, and some even helped him. In every city he bribed people to speak in his favor. "No fortress is impregnable," he would say, "if only one can introduce within it a mule laden with gold." And by these means he conquered one city after another in northern Greece. The most famous opponent of Philip was an orator named Demosthenes. He was the son of an armorer, and was orphaned at the age of 7. His guardians had stolen some of his money, so when he came of age, he sued them and won. He studied the speeches of Isaias and the history of Thucydides, which he memorized. But when he spoke in public, people laughed at him because his voice was weak and he couldn't speak for very long. For years he worked hard to improve his voice. It is said that he locked himself away for months with half of his head shaved so he wouldn't be tempted to go outside. He practiced speaking with pebbles in his mouth and on the seashore so he could be heard over the noise of the crowd. When he returned to the public forum, he was a master of his voice. He always prepared his speeches carefully, and he became the most polished and powerful orator in all of Greece. The rulers of Athens, led by Phocion, desired to maintain peace. Athens lacked the resources to resist the Macedonian king, so Phocion advised waiting until they were ready to make war. However, Demosthenes misunderstood Philip and believed him to be a barbarian. He aligned himself with the party that wanted to make war, and used his oratory skills to convince the Athenians to abandon their policy of peace. For 15 years, Demosthenes delivered speeches urging war, with many of them solely focused on attacking Philip. These speeches were called Philippics, and there were 3 of them. The speeches given to enlist Athenian aid for Olynthus when it was besieged by Philip were called Olympiacs. The first Philippic was delivered in 352. Demosthenes urged the Athenians to equip 50 galleys and be prepared to man them themselves. He rejected the idea of an army of 10,000 or 20,000 foreign soldiers, preferring only citizen soldiers. In the third Philippic, delivered in 341, Demosthenes reminded the Athenians of the progress Philip had made due to their inaction. He criticized the Greeks for not preventing Philip, a hated barbarian, from destroying Greek cities and even celebrating the Pythian Games. He urged the Greeks to work together to stop Philip's increasing power, warning that the disaster would eventually affect everyone. Finally, when Philip took Elatea to the borders of Boeotia, the Athenians, following Demosthenes' advice, decided to go to war and sent envoys to Thebes. Demosthenes led the embassy and convinced the Thebans to ally with Athens and undertake the war. The Athenian and Theban army, hastily assembled, was defeated by Philip's veteran soldiers at the Battle of Cheronea in Boeotia. Demosthenes, then 48 years old, fought as a private soldier. Macedonian supremacy. After his triumph at Cheronea, Philip stationed a military force in Thebes and proposed peace to Athens. He then travelled to the Peloponnesus, where he was welcomed as a liberator by the people who had been oppressed by Sparta. From that moment on, he faced no opposition. In 337, he arrived in Corinth and gathered representatives from all the Greek states, except for Sparta. In Corinth, Philip announced his plan to lead a Greek army in an invasion of Persia. The representatives approved the proposal and established a general confederation of all the Greek states. Each city would govern itself and live in peace with its neighbors. A general council was created to prevent wars, civil strife, proscriptions, and confiscations. The confederation formed an alliance with the king of Macedon and appointed him as the commander of all Greek troops and navies. Every Greek was forbidden from making war on Philip, on pain of banishment. Alexander. In 336, Philip of Macedon was assassinated, leaving his 20-year-old son Alexander to succeed him. Like all Greeks of good lineage, Alexander was accustomed to athletic exercises, a fierce fighter, and an excellent horseman. He alone had been able to tame Bucephalus, his war-horse. However, he was also knowledgeable in politics, eloquence, and natural history, having studied under Aristotle, the greatest scholar of Greece, from the age of 13 to 17. He avidly read the Iliad, considering it a guide to military strategy, and aspired to emulate its heroes. He was truly born to conquer, as he loved to fight and was eager to distinguish himself. His father once told him, "Macedon is too small to contain you." The phalanx. Philip left behind a powerful tool of conquest, the Macedonian army, the best that Greece had ever seen. It consisted of a phalanx of infantry and a corps of cavalry. The mighty phalanx of Macedonians was comprised of 16,000 soldiers, arranged in a formation of 1,000 men at the front and 16 men deep. Each warrior wielded a sarissa, a spear of about 20 feet in length. On the battlefield, the Macedonians did not march towards the enemy in a single direction. Instead, they held their position and presented their pikes to the enemy on all sides. Those in the back held their spears above the heads of the soldiers in the front ranks. The phalanx looked like a monstrous beast, bristling with iron, ready to face any enemy. While the phalanx guarded the field of battle, Alexander led his cavalry to charge the enemy. The Macedonian cavalry was a distinguished group of young nobles. Alexander departed in the spring of 334 with 30,000 infantry, mostly Macedonians, and 4,500 knights. He carried only 70 talents, which was less than $80,000, and supplies for 40 days. He had to fight not only the poorly armed peoples that Xerxes had brought together, but also an army of 50,000 Greeks who had enlisted in the service of the great king under the leadership of a competent general, Memnon of Rhodes. These Greeks could have withstood Alexander's invasion, but Memnon died and his army dispersed. Alexander, freed from his only dangerous opponent, conquered the Persian Empire in just 2 years. 3 victories secured the empire for Alexander. In Asia Minor, he defeated the Persian troops stationed behind the Granicus River in May of 333. In the ravines of Cilicia, at Issus, he routed King Darius and his army of 600,000 men in November of the same year. At Arbela, near the Tigris, he scattered and massacred an even larger army in 331. This was a repeat of the Median Wars. The Persian army was ill-equipped and knew nothing of maneuvering. It was weighed down by its mass of soldiers, servants, and baggage. Only the elite troops gave battle, while the rest was scattered and massacred. Between battles, the conquest was a triumphant procession. No one resisted, except for the city of Tyre, a commercial rival of the Greeks. The peoples of the empire did not care whether they were subject to Darius or Alexander. Each victory gave Alexander control of the entire country. The Granicus opened up Asia Minor, Issus secured Syria and Egypt, and Arbela gave him the rest of the empire. Master of the Persian Empire, Alexander saw himself as the successor to the great king. He donned Persian attire, observed the customs of the Persian court, and compelled his Greek generals to bow before him as was customary in Persia. He even took a wife from the land and married 80 of his officers to daughters of Persian nobles. His goal was to expand his empire to the farthest reaches of the ancient kings, and he marched all the way to India, fighting against the fierce natives. Upon returning to Babylon with his army in 324 BC, he died at the young age of 33 from a brief fever. It is difficult to discern Alexander's true intentions. Did he conquer for the sheer thrill of it, or did he have a grand design? Did he aim to unite all the peoples of his empire, or was he merely following Persia's example? Or perhaps he emulated the great king simply for his own vanity. We cannot know for sure. Nonetheless, his actions yielded significant results. He founded 70 cities, including several in Egypt, Tartary, and India. He distributed the treasures that had been hoarded in the great king's chests to his subjects. He encouraged Greek scholars to study the flora, fauna, and geography of Asia. Most importantly, he readied the people of the Orient to adopt the language and customs of the Greeks. It is for this reason that Alexander is known as the Great, the Hellenes in the Orient. The empire of Alexander dissolved after his death, and his generals fought for 20 years over who would succeed him. They each had a portion of the Macedonian army or some Greek mercenaries on their side, and they fought over who would possess Asia. Eventually only 3 generals remained, and each had carved out a great kingdom for themselves. Ptolemy had Egypt, Seleucus had Syria, and Lysimachus had Macedonia. Other smaller kingdoms were also separated or detached themselves later. In these new kingdoms the king was Greek, and he preserved his language, religion, and customs while his subjects were Asiatics. He sought to maintain a Greek court around him and recruited his army with Greek mercenaries. His administrative officers were Greeks, and he invited Greek poets, scholars, and artists to his court. Before the time of the Persian kings, there were already many Greeks in the empire as colonists, merchants, and soldiers. The Greek kings attracted even more of them, and they came in such numbers that eventually the natives adopted the costume, religion, manners, and language of the Greeks. The Orient ceased to be Asiatic and became Hellenic. By the 1st century BC, the Romans found only peoples like the Greeks who spoke Greek. Alexandria, a city founded on the order of Alexander the Great, became the capital of the Greek kings of Egypt, descendants of Ptolemy. These rulers accepted the title of pharaoh, wore the diadem, and were worshipped as children of the sun, just like the ancient kings. However, they surrounded themselves with Greeks and built their capital on the edge of the sea in a Greek city. Alexandria was more regular than other Greek cities, built on a simple plan with streets intersecting at right angles. A great highway, 100 feet broad and 3.5 miles in length, traversed the whole length of the city. The city was bordered by great monuments, such as the stadium, where public games were presented, the gymnasium, the museum, and the Arsenaeum. The harbour was enclosed with a dike nearly a mile long, which united the mainland to the island of Pharos. At the very extremity of this island, a tower of marble was erected, on the summit of which was maintained a fire always burning to guide the mariners who wished to enter the port. Alexandria superseded the Phoenician cities and became the great port of the entire world. The museum was an immense edifice of marble connected with the royal palace. The kings of Egypt purposed to make it a great scientific institution. The museum contained a great library, and the chief librarian was commissioned to buy all the books that he could find. Every book that entered Egypt was brought to the library, copyists transcribed the manuscript, and a copy was rendered to the owner to indemnify him. Thus they collected 400,000 volumes, an unheard-of number before the invention of printing. Until then, the manuscripts of celebrated books were scarce, always in danger of being lost. Now it was known where to find them. In the museum were also a botanical and zoological garden, an astronomical observatory, a dissecting room established notwithstanding the prejudices of the Egyptians, and even a chemical laboratory. The museum, a sanctuary for scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and grammarians, provided them with lodgings at the state's expense. The king often dined with them to show his esteem. They held conferences and gave lectures, attracting auditors from all corners of the Greek world. Alexandria was the destination for instruction, with nearly 14,000 students in the city. The museum was a library, academy, and school, much like a university, which was unheard of before its time. Alexandria became the meeting place for Orientals, including Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Syrians, who brought their religion, philosophy, and science, all mingling together. For centuries, Alexandria remained the scientific and philosophical capital of the world. In Asia Minor, the kingdom of Pergamum was small and weak, but its capital city, like Alexandria, was a hub for artists and literature. Pergamum's sculptors were renowned in the 3rd century BC. King Attalus assembled all the ancient authors' manuscripts in the city's great library. Pergamum also invented the art of preparing skins to replace papyrus for writing, giving rise to parchment, which preserved the manuscripts of antiquity. Chapter 16. The Last Decadent Years of Greece. In nearly all Greek cities, wealthy families controlled the land, trade, and ships that brought in money. The majority of citizens, however, had no land or money. So what could a poor citizen do to make a living? Work as a farmer, artisan, or sailor. Unfortunately, the wealthy families already had their own farms, workshops, and ships, all run by slaves who were cheaper than free workers because they were poorly fed and not paid. If poor citizens wanted to work on their own, money was scarce, and borrowing was not an option because interest rates were at 10%. Plus, custom prevented citizens from becoming artisans. The philosophers believed that trade harmed the body, weakened the soul, and left no time for public affairs. Aristotle even said that a well-run city should not allow artisans to become citizens. The citizens of Greece were a noble class whose only honorable duties, like the nobles of ancient France, were to govern and go to war. Working with their hands was considered degrading. As a result of the competition with slaves and their elevated status, most citizens were reduced to extreme poverty. The poor were in charge of the cities but had no way to earn a living. They decided to take from the rich, who then formed associations to resist them. Every Greek city was divided into two groups. The rich, called the minority, and the poor, called the majority or the people. The rich and the poor hated each other and fought each other. When the poor gained power, they exiled the rich and took their belongings. They even did two extreme things. They abolished debts and redistributed land. When the rich regained power, they exiled the poor. In many cities, the rich swore to always be an enemy of the people and to harm them as much as possible. There was no way to reconcile the two groups. The rich would not give up their property, and the poor did not want to starve. According to Aristotle, all revolutions start because of the distribution of wealth. Polybius said, "Every civil war is initiated to subvert wealth." They fought brutally, as neighbors often do. In Miletus, the poor were initially in charge and forced the rich to leave the city. Later, regretting that they had not killed them all, they took the children of the exiles, gathered them in barns, and had them trampled by cattle. The rich returned to the city and became its masters. They took the children of the poor, covered them in pitch, and burned them alive. Democracy and oligarchy were the two favored forms of government among the rich and poor parties, respectively. When each party held the city, they put their preferred system into action. The oligarchy, controlled by a select few, was the choice of the wealthy, while the democracy, which gave power to an assembly of the people, was the preference of the poor. Both parties formed alliances with similar groups in other cities, resulting in the division of Greek cities into two leagues, the oligarchy, or the League of the Rich, and the democracy, or the League of the Poor. This arrangement began during the Peloponnesian War, with Athens supporting the Democratic Party and Sparta favoring the oligarchic. Cities where the poor held power allied themselves with Athens, while those where the rich governed joined Sparta. For instance, when the poor gained power in Samos, they killed 200 of the rich, exiled 400, and seized their property. Samos then adopted a democratic government and became an ally of Athens. However, when the Spartan army besieged Samos, they brought with them the exiled rich, who wanted to return to the city by force. Samos was captured, set up an oligarchy, and joined the League of Sparta. Eventually, the poor realized that the democratic form of government was insufficient to maintain their power. In most cities, they agreed to have a leader, known as a tyrant. The tyrant ruled as a master with no regard for the law and could condemn people to death or confiscate their property at will. Mercenaries defended the tyrant against his enemies. An anecdote illustrates the policy of the tyrants. Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, once asked Thrasybulus, the tyrant of Miletus, for advice on how to govern safely. Thrasybulus took the envoy into a field of wheat and walked with him, striking off with his staff all heads that were higher than the others. He sent the envoy away without further advice. The messenger thought Thrasybulus was a fool, but Periander understood that Thrasybulus was advising him to kill the principal citizens. Everywhere the tyrant killed the wealthy and seized their possessions. Often the wealth was distributed among the poor, which is why the people supported the tyrant. In Greece there were tyrants as early as the 6th century. Some, like Pisistratus, Polycrates, and Pittacus, were respected for their wisdom. At that time, anyone who exercised absolute power outside the limits of the constitution was called a tyrant, and it was not considered an insult. However, when the tyrants waged constant war against the rich, they became violent and were hated. The story of Damocles illustrates their situation. Damocles told Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, "You are the happiest of men." Dionysius replied, "I will show you the delight of being a tyrant." He treated Damocles to a sumptuous feast, and ordered his servants to treat the guest with the same honors as himself. During the feast, Damocles looked up and saw a sword hanging from the ceiling by a single hair, directly above his head. The comparison was striking. The tyrant's life hung by a thread. The rich, his enemies, waited for an opportunity to cut it, and assassinating a tyrant was considered praiseworthy. This danger made Dionysius paranoid and cruel. He trusted no one, believed he was only secure after killing all his enemies, and condemned citizens to death on the slightest suspicion. Thus, the name tyrant became synonymous with injustice. The civil wars between the rich and poor continued for nearly 3 centuries, from 430 through 150 BC, exhausting Greece. Many citizens were massacred, and even more were exiled. These exiles wandered in poverty, knowing no trade but that of a soldier. They became mercenaries in the armies of Sparta, Athens, the great king, the Persian satraps, and anyone who would hire them. There were 50,000 Greeks in Darius's service against Alexander, but few returned home. And so it came to pass that the great cities of Greece were left empty, their people scattered and gone. Families grew smaller, with many men choosing not to marry or have children, and others having only one or two. As Polybius once said, "Is this not the root of the problem? When war or sickness takes one of two children, the home is left deserted and the city weakened." Eventually, there were not enough citizens left in the towns to resist a conqueror. This was the time of the Roman conquest, when the Greeks began to see the danger that lay ahead. During the Second War of Rome with Carthage, an assembly was held at Naupactus in 207 BC. A wise Greek orator warned, "Turn your eyes to the west. The Romans and Carthaginians are fighting for something more than just the possession of Italy. A cloud is forming on that coast, and it grows larger every day, threatening Greece." At that time, the Greek cities were divided into two leagues that were hostile to each other. The Aetolians and Achaeans were two small peoples who directed the leagues, commanding the armies and deciding on peace and war, just as Athens and Sparta had done in the past. Each league supported one of the two political parties in the Greek states. The Democratic Party was supported by the Aetolian League, while the Achaean League supported the oligarchical party. However, neither of the two leagues was strong enough to unite all the Greek states. This is when the Romans appeared on the scene. Philip, the king of Macedon, and later Antiochus, the king of Syria, made war on the Romans. However, both were defeated by Rome. Rome destroyed their armies and made them surrender their fleets. Perseus, the new king of Macedon, was also conquered, made prisoner, and his kingdom was overthrown. The Greeks made no effort to unite for the common defense. Rich and poor persisted in their strife, and each hated the other more than the foreigner. The Democratic Party allied itself with Macedon, while the oligarchical party called in the Romans. Even among the Achaeans, Callicrates, a partisan of the Romans, prepared a list of 1,000 citizens whom he accused of having been favorable to Perseus. These suspects were sent to Rome, where they were held for 20 years without trial. At Rhodes, all those who had acted or spoken against Rome were condemned to death. The final battle. It was not long before the Romans were no longer seen as friends. In 197, after defeating the king of Macedon, Consul Flamininus travelled to the Isthmus of Corinth. There he proclaimed to the gathered Greeks, "All Greek peoples are free." The crowd was overjoyed and approached Flamininus to thank him. They wanted to see their liberator, touch his hand, and crown him with garlands. The pressure was so great that Flamininus almost suffocated. The Romans soon began to assert their control and wished to command. The wealthy accepted their sovereignty, and Rome helped them by crushing the poor. This went on for 40 years. Finally, in 147, while Rome was fighting Carthage, the Democratic Party gained power in Greece and declared war on the Romans. Some Greeks were terrified and betrayed their compatriots and themselves to the Roman soldiers. Others fled to safety, or even took their own lives. The opposition leaders seized the property of the wealthy, cancelled debts, and armed the slaves. It was a desperate struggle. Even after being defeated, the Achaeans regrouped and marched into battle with their families. General Diaeus locked himself in his house with his entire family and set it on fire. Corinth had been the center of resistance, but the Romans entered and massacred the men. They sold the women and children into slavery and pillaged and burned the city, destroying priceless works of art. Paintings by great artists were thrown to the ground, and Roman soldiers played dice on them. The Greeks and their influence on Rome. When the Romans conquered the Greeks, they were a people without culture, lacking in literature, science, philosophy, and art. The Greeks, on the other hand, were rich in all these things, and the Romans sought to imitate them. Just as the Assyrians had imitated the Chaldeans and the Persians had imitated the Assyrians, the Romans imitated the Greeks. The Romans did not, however, adopt Greek customs, language, or religion. Instead, Greek scholars and artists flocked to Rome, establishing schools of literature and eloquence. Later it became fashionable for the young men of wealthy Roman families to study in Athens and Alexandria. In this way, the arts and sciences of the Greeks gradually made their way into Rome. As Horace, the Roman poet, put it, "Vanquished Greece overcame her savage conqueror. She brought the arts to uncultured Latium." Although the Romans had their own national architecture, they borrowed the column from the Greeks and often imitated their buildings. Many Roman temples, for example, resemble Greek temples. A wealthy Roman's house typically consisted of two parts, the ancient Roman house and a Greek house added to it. The Greeks were renowned for their sculptures, which could be found in temples, public squares, gymnasia, and private homes. When the Romans conquered Greece, they believed themselves to be the rightful owners of everything that belonged to the vanquished people. Their generals, therefore, removed a great number of statues, transporting them to the temples and porticos of Rome. In the triumph of Aemilius Paulus, the victor over the king of Macedon Perseus, a notable spectacle was 250 wagons full of statues and paintings. Soon the Romans grew accustomed to adorning their theatres, council halls, and private villas with statues. Every great noble wished to have some and commissioned Greek artists to create them. Thus, a Roman school of sculpture was developed, which continued to imitate ancient Greek models. And so it was that Greek sculpture, though a little blunted and disfigured, was spread over all the world, subject to the Romans. Literature-wise, the oldest Latin writer was a Greek, Livius Andronicus, a freedman, a schoolmaster, and later an actor. The first works in Latin were translations from Greek. Livius Andronicus translated the Odyssey and several tragedies. The Roman people took pleasure in Greek pieces and would have no others. Even the Roman authors who wrote for the theatre did nothing but translate or arrange Greek tragedies and comedies. Thus, the celebrated works of Plautus and Terence are imitations of the comedies of Menander and of Diphilus, now lost to us. The Romans also imitated the Greek historians. For a long time it was the fashion to write history, even Roman history in Greek. The only great Roman poets declared themselves pupils of the Greeks. Lucretius wrote only to expound the philosophy of Epicurus. Catullus imitated the poets of Alexander, Virgil, Theocritus, and Homer. Horace translated the odes of the Greek lyrics. Epicureans and Stoics were two sects of Greek philosophers. The Romans had a practical and literal spirit, very indifferent to pure science and metaphysics. They took interest in Greek philosophy only so far as they believed it had a bearing on morals. For the Epicureans, pleasure is the supreme good, not sensual pleasure, but the calm and reasonable pleasure of the temperate man. Happiness consists of the quiet enjoyment of a peaceful life, surrounded by friends and without concern for imaginary goods. For the Stoics, the supreme good is virtue, which consists of conducting oneself according to reason, with a view to the good of the whole universe. Riches, honor, health, beauty, all the goods of earth are nothing for the wise man. Even if one tortures him, he remains happy in the possession of the true good. The Romans were a people divided, taking up the banner of one philosophy or another, often without truly understanding either. Those who claimed to be Epicureans spent their days indulging in food and drink, likening themselves to swine. Meanwhile, those who called themselves Stoics, such as Cato and Brutus, affected a rough language and solemn demeanor, and focused on the hardships of life. Despite this, these doctrines gradually spread, and helped to break down certain prejudices among the Romans. Epicureans and Stoics found common ground in two areas. They rejected the old religion and taught that all men, regardless of status or origin, are equal. Roman students of these philosophies abandoned certain old superstitions and learned to treat their slaves and other peoples with less cruelty and arrogance. When the Romans conquered Greece, they brought with them the arts, letters, and morals of the Greeks, just as the Greeks had spread their language, customs, and religion throughout the Orient during their conquest of the Persian Empire. Chapter 17. Rome and the Ancient People of Italy. The Etruscans were a people shrouded in mystery, both in ancient times and to this day. They were unlike their neighbors and likely originated from far-off lands such as Germany, Asia, or Egypt. However, no one can say for certain. We don't even know what language they spoke. While their alphabet is similar to that of the Greeks, the Etruscan inscriptions only contain proper names, which are too brief to offer any insight into their language. The Etruscans established a confederation of 12 cities in Tuscany, each with its own fortress, king, and government. They also had colonies on both coasts, with 12 in Campania near Naples and another 12 in the Po Valley. Etruria, the land of the Etruscans, was a warm and humid country where the air hung heavily over the inhabitants. The region where they had most of their cities was the famous Maremma, an incredibly fertile area covered in beautiful forests. However, the water had no outlet, forming marshes that poisoned the air. As the Italian proverb goes, in the Maremma, one gets rich in a year but dies in 6 months. Today, all that remains of the Etruscans are their city walls and tombs. When one opens an Etruscan tomb, they are greeted with a porch supported by columns, leading to chambers with couches and bodies laid upon them. The space is adorned with ornaments of gold, ivory, and amber. as well as purple cloths, utensils, and large painted vases. The walls are decorated with paintings of combats, games, banquets, and fantastical scenes, industry and commerce. The Etruscans were skilled in utilizing their fertile soil, but their true forte was as mariners and traders. Like the Phoenicians, they embarked on long journeys to acquire ivory from India, amber from the Baltic, tin, Phoenician purple, Egyptian jewels adorned with hieroglyphics, and even ostrich eggs. All of these objects have been discovered in their tombs. Their navies sailed as far south as Sicily. The Greeks held a deep-seated hatred for them, referring to them as savage Tyrrhenians or Etruscan pirates. At the time, every mariner was a pirate on occasion, and the Etruscans were particularly keen on excluding the Greeks so that they could monopolize the trade of Italy's west coast. The famous Etruscan vases, which have been extracted by the thousands from tombs to enrich our museums, were imitations of Greek vases but produced by the Etruscans. They depict scenes from Greek mythology, particularly the combat surrounding Troy, with human figures in red on a black background. Religion. The Etruscans were a somber people. Their gods were stern and often malevolent. The two most revered gods were the veiled deities, about whom we know nothing. Below them were the gods who hurled lightning, forming a council of 12 gods. Gods of ill omen resided beneath the earth, in the abode of the dead, and are depicted on Etruscan vases. Mantus, the king of the lower world, a winged genius, sits with a crown on his head and a torch in his hand. Other demons, armed with swords or clubs and holding serpents, receive the souls of the dead. The principal figure, known as Charun or the Charon of the Greeks, is an old man of hideous form who wields a heavy mallet to strike his victims. The souls of the dead or the manes emerge from the lower world 3 days a year, wandering the earth, terrifying the living and causing them harm. Human sacrifices are offered to appease their thirst for blood. The famous gladiatorial combats, which the Romans adopted, originated from bloody sacrifices in honor of the dead. The augurs. In ancient times, the Etruscans believed that a mischievous spirit named Tages emerged from a furrow and revealed the secrets of divination to the people. The Etruscan priests, who called themselves haruspices or augurs, had strict guidelines for predicting the future. They examined the entrails of sacrificial animals, observed thunderbolts, and most importantly, studied the flight of birds, hence their name, augurs. To begin, the augur faced north and held a crooked staff in hand, drawing a line that divided the sky into 2 sections. The right side was deemed favorable, while the left was unfavorable. A second line intersected the first at a right angle, and other lines parallel to these created a square in the sky known as the temple. The augur observed the birds that flew within this square, with some, like the eagle, representing good fortune, and others, like the owl, foretelling doom. The Etruscans predicted the future of their people, but they were unique in that they did not believe their civilization would last forever. According to their beliefs, Etruria would endure for 10 centuries. These centuries were not precisely 100 years each, but certain signs marked the end of each period. In the year 44, the year of Caesar's death, a comet appeared, and an Etruscan haruspice proclaimed to the Romans that this comet signaled the end of the 9th century and the beginning of the 10th, the final century of the Etruscan people. The Romans, a semi-barbaric people, often copied their more sophisticated neighbors, the Etruscans. They adopted many aspects of Etruscan religion, including the dress of the priests and magistrates, religious rituals, and the art of divination from birds, known as auspices. When the Romans founded a city, they followed Etruscan customs. The founder plowed a square enclosure with a bronze-tipped plow drawn by a white bull and heifer. Men followed behind, carefully casting the clods of earth from the furrow's side. The entire ditch left by the plow was considered sacred and could not be crossed. To enter the enclosure, the founder had to break the ditch at specific points, lifting the plow and carrying it for a moment. The resulting gap remained profane and became the gate by which one entered. Rome itself was founded using these rites, known as Roma Quadrata, and legend held that the founder had killed his brother for crossing the sacred furrow. Later, the limits of Roman colonies, camps, and even estates were traced according to religious rules and geometric lines. In the rugged mountains of the Apennines, east and south of the Roman plain, there were many tribes. These people did not have the same name and did not form a single nation. They were Umbrians, Sabines, Volscians, Equians, Hernicans, Martians, and Samnites. However, they all spoke almost the same language, worshipped the same gods, and had similar customs. Like the Persians, Hindus, and Greeks, they were of the Caucasian race. Secluded in their mountains, remote from strangers, they remained like the Caucasians of the ancient period. They lived in groups with their herds scattered in the plains, and they had no villages or cities. Fortresses erected on the mountains defended them in times of war. They were brave and martial people, of simple and substantial manners. They later became the strength of the Roman armies. A proverb ran, "Who could vanquish the Martians without the Martians?" The sacred spring. According to legend, in the midst of pressing danger, the Sabines believed their gods to be angry and decided to appease their displeasure by sacrificing everything that was born during a certain spring to the god of war and death. This sacrifice was called a sacred spring. All the children born in this year belonged to the god. When they reached manhood, they left the country and journeyed abroad. These exiles formed several groups, each taking for guidance one of the sacred animals of Italy, a woodpecker, a wolf, or a bull, and followed it as a messenger of the god. Where the animal halted, the band settled itself. It was said that many peoples of Italy originated in these colonies of emigrants and still preserved the name of the animal that had led their ancestors. Such were the Herpines, or people of the wolf, the Picantines, or people of the woodpecker, and the Samnites, whose capital was named Bovianum, or city of the ox. The Samnites. The Samnites were the most powerful of all. They were settled in the Abruzzi, a paradise for brigands. They descended into the fertile plains of Naples and Apulia, and put Etruscan and Greek towns to ransom. The Samnites, a fierce people who fought against the Romans for 2 centuries, were never able to overcome their lack of central administration and discipline. However, they continued to wage war against the Romans. In their final battle, an old man brought a sacred book written on linen to the chiefs of the army. The soldiers formed a wall of linen around an altar and stood with unsheathed swords. The bravest warriors entered the precinct one by one and swore to kill any fugitives and not to flee before the enemy. These warriors, numbering 16,000, donned linen garments and became known as the Linen Legion. They engaged in battle and were slaughtered to the last man, but their bravery was legendary. The Greeks had many colonies in southern Italy, including Sybaris, Croton, and Tarentum. However, they avoided the Roman coast due to fear of the Etruscans. Only the city of Cumae had any significant relations with the Romans until the 3rd century. The Latins, a small people who inhabited the hills and ravines south of the Tiber, were similar to other Italians in language, religion, and manners, but were slightly more advanced in civilization. They built strong cities and cultivated the soil. Each little independent group of people had its own city and government, forming miniature states known as cities. 30 Latin cities formed a religious association similar to the Greek Amphictyones, and they celebrated a common festival every year at Alba, where they sacrificed a bull in honor of their common god, the Latin Jupiter. On the frontier of Latium, near the borders of Etruria, in a marshy plain dotted with hills that followed the Tiber, stood the city of Rome, the hub of the Roman people dispersed throughout the plain. The land was plagued by malaria and desolation, but the location was advantageous. The Tiber acted as a barrier against the enemy from Etruria, and the hills served as fortresses. The sea was only 6 leagues away, far enough to avoid the threat of pirates, yet close enough to allow for the transportation of goods. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, was a suburb of Rome, similar to how Piraeus was to Athens. The area was therefore appealing to a people of warriors and traders. Of the first centuries of Rome, we only know some legends, and the Romans knew no more than we. According to their tales, Rome was a small square town confined to the Palatine Hill. The founder, whom they named Romulus, had traced the circuit with a plough in accordance with Etruscan customs. Every year, on the 21st April, the Romans celebrated the anniversary of these ceremonies. A procession circled the original enclosure, and a priest hammered a nail into a temple to commemorate it. It was estimated that the founding occurred in the year 754 BC. On the other hills facing the Palatine, other small cities emerged. A group of Sabine mountaineers settled on the Capitoline, while a band of Etruscan adventurers established themselves on Mount Caelius. Perhaps there were still other peoples. All of these small settlements eventually joined Rome on the Palatine. A new wall was constructed to encompass the 7 hills. The capital then became for Rome what the Acropolis was for Athens. The temples of the three protecting deities of the city, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, rose here, as well as the citadel that housed the treasure and archives of the people. When laying the foundations, it was said that a recently severed human head was discovered. This head was an omen that Rome would become the head of the world. Chapter 18. Roman Religion. The deities of Rome, much like those of Greece, were believed to be responsible for all occurrences in the world. However, instead of a single god directing the universe, the Romans had a god for each phenomenon they observed. There was a deity for seed germination, another for field boundaries, and yet another for fruit protection. Each had a name, gender, and specific functions. The major gods included Jupiter, the god of heaven; Janus, the two-faced god who opens; Mars, the god of war; Mercury, the god of trade; Vulcan, the god of fire; Neptune, the god of the sea; Ceres, the goddess of grains, the earth, the moon; Juno, and Minerva. Below these were minor deities. Some personified qualities such as youth, concord, health, and peace. Others presided over certain life events, such as a god to teach a child to speak, a goddess to teach a child to drink, and another to knit their bones. 2 accompanied the child to school, and 2 took them home. In short, there were countless minor special deities. Other gods protected cities, sections of mountains, forests, rivers, fountains, and trees. An old woman in a Latin romance once exclaimed, "Our country is so full of gods that it is much easier to find a god than a man." Unlike the Greeks, the Romans did not give their gods a specific form. For a long time there were no idols in Rome. They worshipped Jupiter as a rock and Mars as a sword. Later they imitated the wooden statues of the Etruscans and the marble ones of the Greeks. Perhaps they did not initially think of the gods as having human forms. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans did not imagine marriage and kinship among their gods. They had no legends about these relationships, nor did they know of any Olympus where the gods gathered. The Latin language had a significant word for designating the gods, manifestations. They were the manifestations of a mysterious divine power. This is why they were formless, without family relationships or legends. Everything known about the gods was that each controlled a natural force and could benefit or harm humans. The Romans were not fond of pale and frigid abstractions. They even seemed to fear them. When they invoked the gods, they covered their faces, perhaps so as not to see them. However, they believed that the gods were powerful and would serve them if they knew how to please them. "The man whom the gods favor," says Plautus, "they cause to gain wealth." The Roman people view religion as a transaction of good deeds. The worshipper offers gifts and respect, and in return the gods grant some benefit. If a man gives a gift to a god and receives nothing in return, he feels cheated. When Germanicus fell ill, the people made sacrifices for his recovery. However, when they learned of his death, they became angry and overturned altars and statues of the gods, because they did not do what was expected of them. Even today, Italian peasants curse the saints who do not grant their wishes. Worship involves doing things that please the gods. They receive offerings of fruits, milk, wine, or animal sacrifices. Sometimes statues of the gods are brought from their temples, placed on couches, and served with a feast. Magnificent temples were built for them, and entertainment was arranged. However, it is not enough to make a costly offering to the gods. The Roman gods are particular about the form of worship. They require that all acts of worship, sacrifices, games, and dedications follow the ancient rules or the rites. When offering a victim to Jupiter, one must choose a white animal, sprinkle salted meal on its head, and strike it with an axe. One must stand tall with hands raised to heaven, the home of Jupiter, and recite a sacred formula. If any part of the ceremony fails, the sacrifice is useless, and the god will not be pleased. A magistrate celebrating games in honor of the protecting deities of Rome must follow the rites strictly. If he alters a word in his formula, if a flute player rests, or if an actor stops short, the games do not conform to the rites and must be restarted. Therefore, a wise person seeks the help of 2 priests, one to recite the formula and the other to follow the ritual accurately. Every year, the Arval brothers, a group of priests, gather in a temple near Rome to perform a sacred dance and recite a prayer. The prayer is written in an old language that no one understands anymore, so each priest is given a written formulary at the beginning of the ceremony. Despite not comprehending the prayer, the priests continue to chant it without alteration. This is because the Romans place great importance on following the letter of the law when it comes to their gods. For them, the exactness of the prescribed ritual is their religion, and they consider themselves to be the most religious of men. They believe that they may be inferior or equal to other people in all other aspects, but they excel in their worship of the gods. When a Roman prays, it is not to connect with a god on a spiritual level, but to ask for a favor. The first step is to identify which god can provide the requested service. According to Varro, knowing what god can aid us in a special case is as important as knowing where the carpenter and baker live. Once the appropriate god is identified, the supplicant dons the proper attire and brings an offering, as the gods appreciate neatness and do not like empty-handed visitors. The worshipper then stands erect with their head veiled and invokes the god. However, they do not know the exact name of the god, as no one knows the true names of the gods. Instead they say something like, Jupiter, greatest and best, or whatever is the name that thou preferest. The supplicant then makes their request, using clear language to avoid any misunderstandings. If a libation is offered, the worshipper says, Receive the homage of this wine that I am pouring, to avoid any confusion about the type of wine being presented. The prayers are lengthy, verbose, and full of repetitions. In ancient Rome, just as in Greece, the belief in omens was strong. The gods were thought to have knowledge of the future, and they would send signs that allowed men to interpret them. Before any action was taken, the Romans would consult the gods. For instance, a general about to go to battle would examine the entrails of victims, while magistrates would observe the flight of birds, known as taking the auspices, before holding an assembly. If the signs were favorable, the gods were believed to approve of the enterprise. If not, they were against it. Sometimes the gods would send a sign that had not been requested. Every unexpected phenomenon was seen as a presage of an event. For example, a comet appeared before the death of Caesar, and it was thought to have been a warning. When the assembly of the people deliberated and there was thunder, it was believed that Jupiter did not want any decision to be made that day, and the assembly had to dissolve. Even the most insignificant fact could be interpreted as a sign, such as a flash of lightning, a word overheard, a rat crossing the road, or a diviner met on the way. To avoid being influenced by any portent, Marcellus had himself carried in a closed litter when he had determined on an enterprise. These were not the superstitions of the populace. The Republic supported 6 augurs whose task was to predict the future. It carefully preserved a collection of prophecies, known as the Sibylline Books, and had sacred chickens guarded by priests. No public act, whether an assembly, election, or deliberation, could be done without taking the auspices, which involved observing the flight of birds. In the year 195, it was reported that lightning had struck a temple of Jupiter and hit a hair on the head of the statue of Hercules, and a governor wrote that a chicken with 3 feet had been hatched. The Senate assembled to discuss these portents. In Rome, as in Greece, the priest was not responsible for the care of souls, but existed only to serve the god. He would guard the temple, manage its property, and perform ceremonies in the god's honor. For example, the guild of the Salii, or lepers, watched over a shield that had supposedly fallen from heaven and was worshipped as an idol. Every year they would perform a dance in arms, which was their sole function. The augurs, those who read the signs of the gods, predicted the future. The pontiffs oversaw the ceremonies of worship, regulated the calendar, and determined the festivals to be celebrated throughout the year. Unlike in Egypt, the priests, augurs, and pontiffs in Rome did not form a separate caste. They were chosen from among the great families and continued to hold positions of power in the state, including judging, presiding over assemblies, and commanding armies. The Romans believed, like the Greeks and the Hindus, that the soul survived the body. If the body was buried properly, the soul would go to the lower world and become a god. If not, the soul would return to the earth and torment the living until proper burial was performed. Pliny the Younger tells of a ghost that haunted a house until bones were buried properly, and the shade of Emperor Caligula wandered until his body was reburied in the correct manner. It was important for both the living and the dead that proper funeral rites were observed. The family of the deceased would burn the body on a funeral pyre and place the ashes in an urn, which was then deposited in a tomb dedicated to the manes, the souls that had become gods. The family would visit the tomb on fixed days of the year to bring food and offer nourishment to the soul. These funeral ceremonies were perpetuated for an indefinite period, with the family maintaining the tomb and holding funeral feasts. In return, the souls of their ancestors, now gods, loved and protected their posterity. Each family had its own guardian deities, known as Lares. In the ancient Roman world, the the hearth was a sacred object that every family cherished. The flame was considered a deity, and the hearth was an altar. The Romans believed that the flame should be kept burning day and night, and offerings of oil, fat, wine, and incense were made to it. The fire would then grow brighter and taller as if nourished by the offerings. Before every meal, the Romans would thank the god of the hearth, offer a portion of their food, and pour out a little wine as a libation. Even those who were skeptical, like Horace, would still offer libations and prayers before the hearth. Every Roman family had a sanctuary in their home where they kept the lares, the souls of their ancestors, and the altar of the hearth. Rome also had its own sacred hearth, known as Vesta. The Vestals, 4 virgins from noble families, were tasked with keeping the hearth burning. Only pure beings could be trusted with this duty, as it was essential that the flame never be extinguished. If a Vestal broke her vow, she would be buried alive in a cave for committing sacrilege and endangering the entire Roman people. For the Romans, the family was a religious institution. All members of a family worshipped the same ancestors and gathered around the same hearth. They shared the same gods, and their religion was their own unique possession. The sanctuary where the lares were kept was hidden within the home, and no stranger was allowed to approach it. This made the Roman family a little church, with its own religion and worship that only its members could access. The ancient family was vastly different from the modern family, as it was based on the principles of religion. In ancient Rome, marriage was a sacred institution. The first rule of this religion was that one should be born of a regular marriage to have the right of adoring the ancestors of the family. The father of the bride would give her away outside the house, and a procession would conduct her to the groom's house, chanting an ancient sacred refrain, "Hymen, O Hymen." The bride and groom would then divide a cake of meal between them before the altar of the husband, in the presence of the gods of the family. This period was called confariatio, meaning communion through the cake. Later, another form of marriage was invented, where a relative of the bride, in the presence of witnesses, would sell her to the husband, who would declare that he buys her for his wife. This was called marriage by sale or coemptio. For the Romans, marriage was a religious duty ordained by religion to ensure that the family did not become extinct. When a Roman married, he declared that he takes his wife to perpetuate the family through their children. A noble Roman who sincerely loved his wife repudiated her because she brought him no children. The Roman woman was never free. As a young girl, she belonged to her father, who would choose her husband for her.